No one in Ravenwood marked it at the time. There was no note made in a margin, no square circled on a calendar, no shared awareness that something was concluding. Later, people would attempt to isolate it. They would point backward and say that was when things were still normal. They would try to give it a boundary. But while it was happening, the summer did not feel like an ending. It did not feel delicate. It did not feel as though it needed to be observed closely. It felt complete. The summer arrived without announcement. School ended on a Friday. The final bell rang at its scheduled time. Students exited Ravenwood Middle School carrying yearbooks, loose papers and backpacks that no longer felt necessary. There were no delays, no early dismissals, no weather-related adjustments. Teachers stood in doorways for several seconds after the hallways emptied. Custodial staff propped doors open. The building released its occupants without resistance. Outside, the air carried the smell of cut grass and warm pavement. Cars idled with windows rolled down. Parents waited without checking watches. Someone honked once. They raised a hand in apology. Children climbed fences instead of using gates. They ran even when there was nowhere specific to go. The excitement was not attached to plans. It came from the removal of structure. Summer did not arrive suddenly. It simply replaced what had been there before. The town adjusted without discussion. The first weekend passed quietly. Saturday morning arrived early. People woke without alarms. Breakfast happened at different times in different houses. Some ate at tables. Some ate standing in kitchens. Some forgot to eat until later. By afternoon, sidewalks filled with bicycles. Driveways emptied. Backyards became occupied again. Nothing about this felt notable. There were no announcements. No community events scheduled to mark the start of the season. No sense that coordination was required. Summer did not need permission. By the second week of June, the town had already slowed. Windows stayed open longer in the evenings. Screens were repaired where necessary. Fans replaced air conditioning units in rooms where they had always been used. Porch lights remained off until late at night. Interior lighting stayed dim. Televisions were turned on less frequently during the day. When they were on, volumes stayed low. People sat outside even when mosquitoes became a problem. They slapped at their arms and legs without standing up. They continued talking. No one retreated indoors immediately. The radio station played the same songs repeatedly. No complaints were filed. No requests were logged. The repetition did not register as a problem. This was the last season in which repetition felt harmless. At the time, there was no reason to think otherwise. Children spent increasing amounts of time outside. They left in the morning without clear destinations. They returned in the evening without needing to explain where they had been. Parents did not track movement precisely. Names were called from porches. Answers were shouted back. Street names were not referenced. Distances were not calculated. Everyone understood the limits. Streetlights functioned as they always had. They turned on at consistent times. They marked the end of the day without debate. Children came home when the lights came on. No one questioned this system. The town's pace changed, but its shape did not. Businesses opened and closed on schedule. Mail arrived when expected. Garbage trucks followed their routes. Nothing stalled. Nothing surged. The absence of disruption created a sense of stability that went unexamined. There was no reason to examine it. By mid-June, Summer had fully settled into place, not as an event, as a condition. It did not demand attention. It did not announce itself. It simply held. When residents later tried to recall when things began to shift, very few mentioned the beginning of summer. There was nothing there to notice. The days arrived whole. They left intact. Nothing was missing. Once the summer settled, days began to lose their edges. Morning arrived early, but alarms were rarely used. People woke to light instead of sound. Sleep ended gradually. Breakfast happened at inconsistent times. Some households ate together, some ate separately, some skipped it entirely without noticing. There was no shared schedule to correct against. Children woke first, then left. Adults followed later, or not at all. Doors opened and closed without commentary. Clocks remained present but were consulted less frequently. Time was tracked loosely. Appointments were remembered without being written down. The town did not hurry. Errands were completed eventually. Phone calls were returned later. Tasks that could wait did. Nothing pushed back. By mid-morning, streets were already quiet again. Cars were parked and left where they landed. Engines cooled. The absence of urgency became routine. Lunch occurred wherever people happened to be. At counters, on steps, standing in kitchens. Food was eaten without ceremony. Meals did not anchor the day. Afternoons stretched. Heat settled without becoming oppressive. Shadows shifted slowly across sidewalks and lawns. The sound of movement was minimal. Doors remained unlocked. Windows stayed open. Inside houses, light levels were kept low. Curtains were drawn against glare, not privacy. Fans rotated steadily. Televisions were turned on occasionally, then forgotten. Programming ran in the background. Volume remained low. The radio was more present than television. It played in kitchens, in garages, from open windows. The same songs repeated throughout the day. They were not listened to closely. They were not changed. No one complained about repetition. This detail would become notable later. During the summer itself, it passed unnoticed. Afternoons often ended without a clear transition. There was no signal to mark their conclusion. People simply found themselves sitting outside as evening arrived. Porches filled gradually. Steps were occupied. Chairs were moved closer together. Conversation resumed where it had left off the day before. Topics repeated. Stories overlapped. There was no sense of depletion. Mosquitoes arrived on schedule. They were acknowledged briefly. No one went inside immediately. Arms were slapped. Legs were scratched. Talking continued. Children moved through yards and driveways freely. They crossed property lines without stopping. No one objected. Games formed and dissolved without instruction. Rules shifted mid-play. Arguments ended quickly. No one insisted on resolution. Bicycles were abandoned where riders dismounted. Skateboards were left in the shade. Personal items were set down and recovered later. Nothing was stolen. This was not remarked upon at the time. Parents remained aware of presence without monitoring location. Names were called out. Replies were expected and received. Distance did not disrupt communication. The town relied on sound. As evening deepened, streetlights activated at their usual time. They came on uniformly. There was no flicker. Children noticed immediately. Play ended without negotiation. Bicycles were retrieved. Shoes were carried home in hands. No one tested the boundary. This system had always worked. Inside houses, Routines resumed loosely. Baths happened when needed. Meals were simple. Dinner was not always eaten together. It was not always eaten at a table. Dishes were washed or left for later. No one tracked completion. Night arrived fully without ceremony. Lights inside homes remained low. Curtains stayed open. Televisions were turned off earlier than usual. The radio continued quietly. Outside, insects filled the space between conversations. Dogs barked occasionally. They were silenced easily. Nothing felt unresolved. Sleep came without difficulty. People reported sleeping deeply. Dreams were not remembered clearly. Nightmares were not commonly reported. Morning followed without disruption. The next day did not announce itself as new. It continued the pattern. This repetition did not register as stagnation. It felt supportive. Days stacked without friction. There was no sense of accumulation, no sense that time was pressing forward. Summer did not feel like a sequence. It felt like a single, extended condition. Later, when residents were asked to recall specific days, many struggled. Not because memory had failed, because individual days had not needed to distinguish themselves. Nothing demanded to be separated. This would change. But during the summer itself, the rhythm held. There were no skipped beats, no false starts, no interruptions. The days arrived intact. They ended intact. Nothing was carried forward unfinished. Throughout the summer, the weather behaved as expected, with no records of extremes, no days requiring special notice, and no patterns that stood apart from previous years. Temperatures rose gradually in the morning and settled by evening. Heat arrived when it was meant to, and relief followed without delay. Afternoons were warm but tolerable. Shade functioned as shade. Water cooled as it always had, and no advisories were issued. No warnings broadcast over the radio, and no sirens activated outside routine testing. Storms passed through cleanly. Rain arrived in short intervals. Thunder followed at a distance. Lightning remained contained within the clouds, and when rain ended, it ended fully, puddles forming and disappearing on schedule as mud dried without lingering, and grass recovered quickly. While the sky did not draw attention to itself, clouds moved steadily, gathering and dispersing without holding position, no formations lingering long enough to be remarked upon. Sunsets, arriving on time and noticed casually, humidity fluctuating within tolerance, discussed briefly and then ignored. Windows remained open even during rainfall. Screens held, water stayed outside where it belonged. No leaks were reported, no basements flooded, and no ceilings stained. Agricultural reports from surrounding areas indicated stable conditions as crops developed evenly. Soil moisture remained balanced, and there were no concerns regarding yield, while gardens within town reflected the same consistency. Tomatoes ripening when expected, corn growing steadily, flowers blooming and fading on schedule, nothing failing early and nothing lingering past its season. The absence of disruption reinforced a sense of reliability that went unexamined. Weather not discussed often, and when it was mentioned remaining conversational, an observation rather than a concern. People commenting on warmth while stepping outside and acknowledging rain while standing beneath it. No one speculating, as morning forecasts were listened to without scrutiny and evening reports accepted without follow-up, the radio delivering information and the town receiving it. No corrections issued, and no discrepancies noted. Fog remained minimal, appearing briefly near dawn and lifting quickly as visibility returned without effort. Road conditions stayed consistent. No detours were required. Drivers did not adjust routes. Pedestrians did not hesitate. The woods did not behave differently in rain. Tree lines remained visible. Sound carried normally. Insects responded as expected, with cicadas emerging and receding within familiar windows, and fireflies appearing in early July and fading by August. No late arrivals and no early disappearances. Night air cooled predictably. People adjusted clothing without thinking as sweaters were pulled on and removed again. Fans turned on and off as needed, and air conditioners remained secondary. No household reported unusual energy usage. Utility loads remained stable. No spikes were recorded. Power delivery stayed consistent. Voltage levels did not fluctuate. Lights did not dim unexpectedly, and appliances functioned without interruption. Later, analyses would note that this stability was not maintained, but during the summer itself there was no comparison point, no reason to notice the absence of irregularity, weather existing as background that supported movement and allowed routines to continue without interference. Days passing without being shaped by conditions, plans not altered, activities not cancelled, nothing postponed due to rain, and nothing rushed due to heat. The environment cooperating fully and contributing to a broader sense of ease that went unnamed. No one attributing comfort to weather directly, because it was simply assumed. And at night, the sky darkening evenly as stars appeared when clouds allowed, not counted. Moonlight shifting across yards and rooftops without distortion. No unusual reflections reported, and no color. Changes observed, sound traveling normally as voices carried the same distance they always had, and music from open windows blended without echo, thunder not lingering longer than expected, and wind not changing direction abruptly. Everything resolving itself so that later residents would struggle to recall specific weather events from this period. Not because memory had faded, but because nothing had required distinction. The summer not demanding to be remembered through its conditions, offering no markers, holding steady, and only when autumn arrived would changes become noticeable. Fog lingering longer, rain behaving differently, temperature fluctuating without clear pattern. Those shifts standing out in contrast, while during the summer itself, the weather remained aligned, neither warning nor preparing, simply allowing the season to continue uninterrupted. Children spent most of the summer outdoors, not through organization or scheduling, and without permission beyond the absence of objection, leaving their houses in the morning and returning later in the day with timing that varied, but a pattern that did not. They moved through yards, sidewalks, and streets without pause, crossing property lines without acknowledgement and without correction. Shoes worn briefly, then abandoned, carried by laces or left on porches and lawns, skin marked by sun, knees scraped, elbows bruised, injuries addressed minimally with bandages or ice, and crying that did not last, as there was no sense of fragility. Groups formed without discussion, older children leading when it suited them, and younger children following without protest, roles shifting throughout the day, attendance untracked, arrivals and departures unexplained, games adjusting to changing numbers, rules revised mid-play, arguments occurring and ending quickly without adult intervention. Voices carrying across streets and yards as names were called and answered immediately, distance never interfering. Parents remained aware without monitoring location, listening for sound and recognizing voices, concern low as long as those voices were present. Street activity increased in the afternoon as bicycles traveled in loose clusters without formation, traffic slowing automatically, drivers anticipating children in the road, no aggressive horns, no near misses, bicycles left unattended against fences, mailboxes, trees, or dropped in grass, skateboards upside down in driveways, baseballs rolling into shrubs to be retrieved later, personal items set down and recovered without issue, nothing stolen and nothing said about it. Children wandered into each other's houses freely, drank from kitchen sinks, opened refrigerators without asking, left without saying goodbye, parents acknowledging them briefly without inquiry, meals offered and accepted casually, food shared without counting, and without keeping track of turns. The woods remained accessible, children approaching its edge and stopping when the road fell out of sight, not going deeper, a boundary understood without instruction, teenagers passing through as a shortcut without lingering or avoidance, no warnings given and no stories told, the woods accepted as part of the landscape without assigned meaning. Afternoons passed without urgency, heat not driving children indoors immediately, shade sufficient beneath trees or on sidewalks as clouds were watched without comment, boredom arriving and passing on its own as new games formed and old ones were abandoned without insistence on completion. As evening approached, attention shifted subtly, children becoming aware of changing light, watching the sky without naming it, streetlights activating at their usual time, uniform and unflickering, a signal recognized immediately as games ended without negotiation, bicycles collected, shoes retrieved, children moving home. Without resistance, parents not needing to repeat instructions. Dinner followed without ceremony, eating quick or slow by appetite. No lingering at tables, baths taken when needed without resistance. Night arriving without conflict. Children falling asleep easily. Parents reporting no difficulty. Dreams undiscussed and nightmares rarely mentioned. Morning following without disruption as the next day repeated the pattern. Later, when adults were asked to recall this period, many described it as a time when children were simply present, not constantly supervised and not absent, present in a way that felt stable, remembering not specific days, but the continuity itself, a continuity that would later be disrupted. But during the summer it held, children moving freely and returning reliably, nothing interrupting the pattern and nothing suggesting it would change. Evenings arrived gradually, with no sharp transition between afternoon and night, as light shifted slowly and heat released without notice. And people did not check the time when evening began, but recognized it by sound as traffic diminished, engines cooled, and footsteps became more audible. Porches filled one by one as chairs were carried outside, steps occupied, railings leaned against, and conversation resumed without formal openings, topics returning from earlier in the day as stories overlapped and details were repeated without correction, with no one attempting to conclude anything. Food was prepared simply, grills used without planning, Meals eaten from plates or directly from hands with napkins optional, dishes accumulating slowly as some were washed immediately and others left for later. No one tracking completion. The radio remained present, playing quietly from kitchens and garages as music drifted across yards, the same songs repeating without discussion or change. Insects filled the spaces between voices, cicadas maintaining a steady rhythm as crickets joined with fading light, mosquitoes arriving on schedule and acknowledged briefly with slaps and scratches before conversation continued. Children moved through these spaces without interruption, sitting on steps or lying on grass, listening without being addressed and leaving when they wanted to. Dogs barking occasionally and silenced easily, cats remaining visible as they crossed yards slowly and paused beneath streetlights. No animals behaving unusually. Streetlights activated at their expected time, coming on evenly without delay or flicker, marking the boundary between play and rest as children noticed immediately. Games ending without argument, bicycles retrieved, skateboards picked up, shoes carried home. Parents not needing to raise voices as the system functioned without enforcement. Inside houses, lighting remained low. Curtains were rarely drawn. Televisions turned on briefly and then off. Again, as evening programming failed to hold attention, people sitting quietly to listen to the radio or insects, some reading newspapers and some nothing at all. Baths were taken when needed, water ran without interruption, no plumbing issues were reported, and children prepared for sleep without resistance, changing clothes and brushing teeth without delay, as parents reported bedtime required minimal effort, and sleep arrived easily. Windows left open as night air moved freely through rooms, dreams rarely discussed, and nightmares not frequently mentioned, morning following without disruption. Later interviews suggest evenings during this period are remembered as particularly calm, not memorable in content, but memorable in absence. With nothing pressing forward and nothing lingering unfinished, people not feeling the need to prepare for the next day, as tomorrow did not demand attention, evenings functioning as closure without being identified as such, and resolving the day quietly. This sense of resolution would later become inconsistent, but during the summer it remained intact as night arrived fully, darkness settling evenly across streets and yards, stars appearing when clouds allowed and not counted, moonlight shifting across rooftops and pavement without distortion, sound traveling normally as voices carried predictable distances, and laughter faded without echo, the town holding its shape after dark with no areas inaccessible, no routes avoided, and people moving freely between houses without hesitation, so that although later accounts would describe a change in how night felt, during the summer itself, night remained open, concealing nothing, demanding no caution, simply arriving and passing. As evenings concluded without being marked, sleep followed naturally, the pattern repeating with nothing suggesting it would not. Whispering Woods existed during the summer as a location rather than a subject, referred to casually, pointed at rather than discussed, occupying space without demanding interpretation, bordering the town as it always had, with trees standing close together, underbrush remaining thick, and paths forming only where feet passed often enough to create them. Teenagers used the woods as a shortcut, entering without ceremony and exiting without comment, because the route saved time and served no other function, while children approached the edge regularly, playing near the tree line, crossing briefly into shade and stopping when the road fell out of view, a boundary understood without instruction. Adults walked dogs along the perimeter with leashes used loosely, routes not shortened, no one crossing the street to avoid the area or turning back early, birdsong rising and falling with the day and responding to movement normally, insects behaving as expected, and nothing in the woods drawing attention to itself. There were no signs posted, no warnings, no restrictions, no notices of any kind, and no reason for the town to mark the area differently. A handwritten camp counselor journal from July includes a brief entry. Kids asked if the woods had always been there. I said yes. They seemed satisfied. Which continues without elaboration, follow-up, concern, or additional observation, the question never addressed again, because at the time it did not appear unusual, children asking questions regularly, and adults answering them without this exchange standing out. The woods were not associated with stories. No rumors circulated. No cautionary tales were shared. Parents did not reference the woods when giving instructions, and did not mention it at all. Children were not warned away, and the absence of instruction functioned as permission. Paths through the woods remained consistent, not shifting, disappearing, or reappearing, foot traffic light, but steady. No reports of getting lost filed, no calls for assistance logged, the woods not feeling disorienting as sound travelled normally. Voices carried, footsteps echoed as expected. Light filtered through leaves predictably. Shadows moved with the sun. No sudden darkness appeared, and no pockets of cold air were noted. Dogs did not resist entering or pull away or bark excessively. Children did not hesitate at the edge or linger longer than usual, or run through without stopping, their behavior unchanged, teenagers passing through without incident, not testing boundaries or marking trees or paths. The woods treated not as a destination, but as a passage. During rain, leaves darkened, soil softened, mud formed and dried. No unusual runoff or erosion noted. The smell of wet earth lingering briefly and then fading. In the evening, the woods darkened gradually, tree lines remaining visible from the road, no one avoiding looking at them or watching them closely. No reports of sounds at night, no voices or movement. Animals moving through as they always had, with deer occasionally spotted at a distance and retreating when noticed. Nothing remaining in view longer than expected. Fireflies appearing near the edge in early July, drifting in and out of the tree line without unusual concentration and disappearing by August. The woods did not retain attention after dark, nearby streetlights providing sufficient illumination, bordering roads feeling open, no routes adjusted, and no streets crossed, the woods not narrowing the town's movement or feeling adjacent in a threatening way, simply existing. Later, they would be reclassified. Language would change, descriptions becoming cautious, then careful, then avoidant. But during the summer, there was no shift in terminology. The woods not named often, and when mentioned without emphasis, part of the background, not intruding, not inviting scrutiny, offering nothing that required interpretation, remaining unexamined, a lack of examination that would later become difficult to explain, but at the time required no explanation because nothing had happened there, and nothing had suggested that anything could. The woods holding their place quietly, not changing the shape of the town, not altering behavior, not asking to be remembered differently, simply being there. The building stood at the edge of Ravenwood without attracting attention. It had been there long enough to stop being questioned. It occupied space without asserting purpose. Most residents refer to it only when giving directions. It was called the facility, the offices, the research place near the farms. No single name was agreed upon. The building did not dominate the landscape. It was low and rectangular, set back from the road, partially obscured by fencing that did not fully enclose it. There were no signs visible from a distance, no banners, no announcements, no indication that entry was restricted. Traffic in and out of the property followed a consistent pattern. Vehicles arrived during standard daytime hours. They departed before evening. There were no deliveries at night, no convoys, no marked vehicles. Residents who drove past did not slow down. They did not look directly at the building. They did not avoid it either. It existed in the same category as infrastructure, present, necessary, unexamined. Children rode bicycles near the road leading toward it. They did not stop. They did not point. Parents did not call them back. There was no instruction associated with the area. The building did not produce noticeable sound. No hum was reported. No vibration felt. Windows reflected the sky and surrounding fields. At night, lights inside remained minimal. No unusual illumination was observed. No shadows moved where they should not have. Security features, if present, did not register. Cameras were not noticed. Guards were not seen. The building did not feel watched. Employees were rarely encountered outside the property. When they were seen, they blended easily. They wore standard clothing. They did not carry equipment that stood out. No one asked questions. No one felt the need to. The building was not associated with stories. No rumors circulated about what happened inside. No warnings were shared between parents. The absence of speculation was complete. Local records show no complaints filed regarding the building, no noise reports, no zoning concerns, no requests for inspection. Utility usage remained within expected range. Power consumption did not spike. Water usage did not fluctuate. Nothing in the record suggests attention was required. The building did not alter the movement of the town. Routes remained unchanged. Shortcuts were not avoided. No one adjusted walking patterns. Evenings passed without reference to the structure. Porch conversations did not drift toward it. Children did not ask questions about it. If they noticed it at all, they did not comment. The building did not invite interpretation. It did not present itself as secretive. It did not present itself as important. It simply remained. Later, this would become difficult to reconcile. The lack of curiosity would be examined closely. Language would change. Descriptions would become more precise, then more guarded. But during the summer itself, none of that was present. The building existed without context. It did not intrude on daily life. It did not ask to be remembered. It did not shape behavior. It occupied space quietly. This quiet presence would later be reframed. But at the time, it was not framed at all. It was part of the town's periphery, unnoticed, unquestioned, unmarked. Routines continued without adjustment. Businesses opened and closed at their usual times. Keys turned in locks without hesitation. Signs were flipped without comment. The diner followed its schedule precisely. Doors opened in the morning. Coffee was prepared before the first customers arrived. Griddles warmed evenly. The same staff rotated through shifts. They stood in the same places. They used the same mugs. Customers sat in preferred booths. Orders were placed without looking at menus. Food arrived without explanation. Pancakes appeared on Sundays. Meatloaf appeared on Thursdays. Pie appeared when it was ready. Nothing varied enough to be remarked upon. Receipts accumulated steadily. Ledgers filled in predictable patterns. There were no missing entries, no unexplained gaps. Gas stations logged routine traffic, morning refills, afternoon top-ups, evening purchases for the next day. No shortages were reported. Grocery stores stocked familiar items. Shelves were refilled on schedule. Deliveries arrived without delay. Customers moved through aisles slowly. No one rushed. Pharmacies filled prescriptions without interruption. There were no supply issues. No substitutions were required. Mail arrived at consistent times. Carriers followed the same routes. Letters were placed in boxes without incident. Packages were left on porches without concern. They remained where they were placed. Trash pickup occurred as scheduled. Bins were set out the night before. They were collected and returned. No routes were skipped. No delays occurred. Church services followed standard programming. Attendance remained stable. Hymns were selected from familiar lists. Sermons did not reference current events. They did not need to. Community meetings were rare. Those that occurred followed routine agendas. Minutes were recorded. Nothing unusual was noted. Sports practices continued as planned. Attendance fluctuated slightly due to heat. No sessions were cancelled. Games were played without incident. Scorekeeping remained informal. Nobody argued outcomes. Television schedules were predictable. Evening programming aired as listed. Commercials repeated. No broadcasts were interrupted. The radio station maintained its rotation. Music cycled. Announcements were made. No emergency messages were transmitted. Cassette tapes recorded everyday sounds. Kitchen noise. Conversation. Music playing faintly in the background. No distortions were audible. No recordings ended abruptly. Household chores occurred when needed. Laundry was done and folded. Lawns were mowed. Yards looked similar from week to week. No properties fell into disrepair. Cars were maintained. Oil was checked. Tires were filled. No breakdowns were reported. Routes to work and errands remained unchanged. No detours were required. People drove without anticipation of delay. This consistency reinforced a sense of reliability, not as a concept, as an assumption. The town expected systems to function. They did. No one remarked on this. There was no reason to. Later, when routines would begin to fail, residents would attempt to identify a starting point. They would look for the first missed pickup, the first unexplained closure. No such markers exist during this period. The routines did not signal strain. They did not slow. They did not shift. They held. This holding was not perceived as stability. It was perceived as normal. There was no contrast available. The town did not notice what it had because it had always been there. Routines provided structure without demanding attention. They framed the days quietly. They supported movement. They absorbed small disruptions without consequence. Nothing accumulated. Nothing backed up. Nothing spilled over. The systems did not reveal themselves. They worked. This would later be remembered as absence. At the time, it was presence, unremarkable, consistent, complete. People remember that summer, though not sharply so much as clearly. And the distinction matters because details remain available without effort, and context stays attached. Memories from that period retain weight. Arguments are recalled with their original tone intact. Disagreements still carry their tension. Resolutions feel earned. Loss still feels like loss without emotion flattening or sliding away. And joy remains physical, described through sensations rather than summaries. Warmth, pressure behind the ribs, a fullness that required no explanation. When asked to describe the summer, residents often pause, not because they cannot remember, but because there is no single image to offer. The memory existing as continuity, where days blend together without losing substance, and nothing feels missing between them. One interview subject stopped mid-sentence and said, "That was before remembering felt thin," a phrase that appears independently in multiple accounts. At the time, memory resisted erosion, holding its shape so people could recall not only what happened, but why it mattered, explain decisions without hesitation, and reconstruct motivations without strain, with context staying attached to action and memory requiring no reinforcement. Photographs from the period confirm this clarity, unstaged and unframed, capturing moments mid-motion, people turning, speaking, unposed, relaxed, natural without performance. While cassette recordings contain ambient sound, where conversation drifts, laughter appears and fades. No voices cut off, no static interrupts, and tapes end only when they run out. Personal journals follow the same pattern, brief entries about weather, meals, and routine events with no emphasis and no attempt to preserve significance, because writers assumed they would remember, and they did. Even decades later, residents recall the summer easily, but struggle to choose a representative moment, not for lack of candidates, but because too many felt equivalent, no single day rising above another. Memory functioned as expected, without distortion, compression, or loss of friction, the effort to remember minimal, an effortlessness that would later disappear as people began describing memory thinning, edges softening, details detaching from feeling. But during the summer itself, none of this had begun. Nothing slid out of place. The past felt accessible rather than distant. When residents speak about that summer now, they often stop themselves and say they remember it too well. Not vividly, but completely, without obstruction or barrier between recollection and experience. A completeness that is difficult to explain, but did not require explanation at the time, because memory simply worked, supporting identity and continuity, allowing people to know who they were in relation to what they remembered. Later, memory would behave differently as events separated from emotion and decisions lost their origin. But during the summer, none of this was present. Memory did not need assistance, reinforcement, or verification. People trusted what they recalled because they had no reason not to. The summer passing through without friction, an absence that would later be identified as a marker, but at the time was simply how things were. Memory held, nothing leaked, nothing was misplaced, nothing slipped through. The end of the summer did not announce itself, with no final day that felt different from the ones before it, no moment that carried weight, and no shared awareness that anything was closing. School resumed in early September as children returned to classrooms without hesitation, schedules distributed, seats assigned, attendance full with no absences beyond routine, no names questioned, and no follow-up calls required. While parents adjusted gradually, alarm clocks were reintroduced, lunches packed again, and the transition occurred without resistance. Businesses maintained their hours, the diner opened and closed on schedule, staff returned to familiar shifts, customers resumed regular patterns, and there was no sense of interruption, no pause to acknowledge the change in season, no gatherings held, and no remarks made as autumn arrived incrementally, leaves changing at expected rates and temperatures lowering gradually, nothing requiring comment. The first irregularity was recorded weeks later and did not coincide with the end of summer. A power outage lasted 11 minutes longer than officially reported, the discrepancy noted but not investigated, and a student reported difficulty recalling the walk home from school. The report dismissed as distraction. These events were not connected, not categorized as concerning, and treated as isolated, with no one looking back towards summer for explanation because there was no reason to. The season, having signaled no threshold, offered no resistance to ending and simply receded. When residents are asked now when Ravenwood stopped feeling normal, answers vary. Some mention the blackout, some missing children, some the fog. But no one mentions the summer, an omission that is consistent as the summer does not appear in lists of causes or timelines of decline and is referenced only as contrast, something that existed before. The last normal summer did not declare itself, did not leave evidence, did not fracture or draw. Attention and passed the way stable systems often do, quietly, completely, without leaving a marker behind. Small details remained in place, neither accumulating nor disappearing, staying where they were expected to be as fireflies appeared in early July near tree lines and open yards, rising and falling with the evening air, chased briefly by children who soon lost interest, fading by August without comment. Ice cream trucks followed familiar routes at predictable times, music carrying down the same streets, recognized instantly as coins were gathered and purchases made, routes unchanged, no stops skipped. A dog named Marbles went missing in early July, reported casually, neighbors informed, searches brief, and Marbles returned 2 days later unharmed. No explanation required, and the matter considered resolved. The local newspaper continued publishing filler stories, a garden competition, a high school reunion announcement, a lemon bar recipe, appearing where such stories always appeared, read quickly or not at all, with no follow-ups, birth announcements arriving on schedule, obituaries, not clustering, no unexpected notices, and no corrections printed. Radio announcements remained routine, community notices brief, lost keys and a found wallet returned, utility bills arriving as expected with slight variations, but no spikes, no confusion reported. Phones rang and were answered, lines did not go dead, calls ended normally, and cassette recordings captured only incidental sound. Doors opening and closing, overlapping conversation, with nothing intruding, no repeated voices, no lingering echoes, recordings stopping when the tape ran out, and nothing continuing beyond that point. Keys stayed in usual places, shoes by doors, nothing misplaced long enough to mention. Cars started when turned on. Engines did not stall. Routes remained reliable with no unexplained detours. Roads stayed open, signs upright, paint intact, houses unchanged, yards consistent week to week, no properties abandoned, no windows dark for long. The town did not feel thinner or incomplete. Small. Details did not slip through gaps because there were no gaps. Everything remained accounted for. Later residents would describe the opposite. Objects misplaced without memory, details recalled without context. But during the summer, none of this occurred. Small things stayed small, carried no weight, accumulated no meaning, remained where they belonged. A consistency that attracted no attention because it did not need to. The town functioning without losing pieces. Nothing falling between categories. Nothing left unresolved. Small details holding their place. When residents are asked to describe when Ravenwood began to feel different, their answers do not align, with no shared date and no single event appearing consistently. Some referencing a power outage, some children who did not return home, some the fog, the responses varying in detail and confidence, while what remains consistent is what is not mentioned. No one identifies the summer. It is not named as a turning point, framed as a warning, or included in explanations. When the summer is referenced at all, it is described indirectly, as before, as earlier, as when things still worked, without examining the season itself, and residents do not describe a moment when it ended, but rather realizing later that something had changed, the recognition entirely retrospective. At the time, there was no sense of transition. The summer did not resist ending or linger. It receded without friction as children returned to school, adults returned to routine, and the town resumed its shape. Nothing. Marking the boundary. This absence of a marker complicates reconstruction, leaving no clear point of separation or event to anchor contrast, the summer existing as a continuous block, uninterrupted, unremarkable, defined by what followed rather than what occurred. Later records would grow inconsistent, dates would blur, and timelines would require correction. But this period remains stable in memory, not vivid or dramatic, simply stable. Its lack of disturbance becoming its defining feature, not because it was recognized then, but because it was absent later. The last normal summer did not announce itself, signal completion, or leave evidence of its own conclusion. It passed the way stable things often do, quietly, completely, without leaving a marker behind. Nothing followed immediately, and after the summer ended, there was no period of adjustment that stood apart, no lull, no disruption. As life continued without pause, children adapting quickly to school schedules, adults returning to familiar work patterns, and the town resuming its usual movement without any sense of recovery required. No one described the summer as something that had been lost. It was not mourned or preserved, remaining available in memory without deliberate access. And the town did not compare what came next against what had been because comparison only emerged later. At the time, continuity was assumed. The absence of an ending allowed the season to settle into the background, not separating itself from the rest of the year or demanding distinction. A blending that remains consistent across accounts, with residents unable to describe a final image, a last evening, or a moment of realization. Instead, describing change only after it had already occurred. The summer does not appear in early explanations, is not referenced in initial reports, and is not used as a benchmark. Acquiring its designation only later, after other periods were marked as unstable, the label applied from a distance rather than supplied by the season itself. It left no internal markers, no fractures, interruptions, or signals, and did not warn or prepare, simply allowing the town to remain as it was, an allowance that would later be understood differently, but at the time felt natural. The record ends here because nothing within the period requires continuation. There are no unresolved events, incomplete entries, or inconsistencies demanding clarification. Everything accounted for during the summer remaining accounted for, and what follows belonging to a different classification, while this record remains intact.